I'll just give a brief introduction of yours to all our viewers who are watching it for the first time. So today we have among us Phil Gurski. He has served for more than 30 years as an analyst in the Canadian intelligence community. In 2001, he joined CSIS, where he was a strategic analyst specializing in homegrown Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorism and radicalization to violence. In 2013, he moved to Public Safety Canada as a senior strategic advisor on Canada's countering violent extremism policy. And I think he retired in 2015, right?
That's right, 2015, yep.
Yeah. So he's the author of 5 books and currently the president and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting and its program director for the Security, Economics, and Technology Hub at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and coming on the show. It's a pleasure hosting you.
It is a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our exchange.
So that go for the first one.
Yeah, sure. I'll go for the first one. Thank you, Mr. Gurski, for joining us today. And a very little is known about the Canadian Service Intelligence, or in fact, the Canadian intelligence apparatus altogether. Can you give us a brief idea about the Canadian intelligence agencies and how the intelligence apparatus of the country works and functions in countering internal threats as well as external threats?
Certainly. So again, thank you for hosting me on this this webinar. Canada doesn't normally feature, I think, in a lot of people's radars when it comes to security intelligence. I think being the neighbor of the United States, obviously they have a much bigger power and are much better well known. But we in Canada have a number of intelligence organizations, both of which actually I used to work for. So the Canadian Security Intelligence Service is, as the name suggests, it is an organization that is concerned with threats to the security of Canada, largely from terrorism and from foreign espionage and foreign interference. For the listeners or the watchers of this webinar, if you look at what's called the Thesis Act, which was passed by the Canadian Parliament in 1984, it explains the 4 main areas that CSIS looks at. CSIS was an outgrowth of the old RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police's security service. And for a variety of reasons, it was decided in the early 1980s to separate intelligence from law enforcement. So other countries combined the two. It was combined in Canada for the better part of a century, but now are separate organizations. The other main intelligence agency is called Communications Security Establishment. It is a signals intelligence organization. If you're familiar with the National Security Agency, United States, or the GCHQ in Britain, it's a very analogous to that kind of thing. Canada, as a small player internationally, benefits greatly from its relationships with foreign partners. So both the RCMP and CSE and CSIS do enter into sharing agreements with intelligence organizations around the world. So CSIS, just as one example, has a mechanism under its legislation it's called Section 17 of the CSIS Act, whereby it is authorized with government approval to enter into a relationship with other intelligence services outside of Canada to both share and get intelligence information from those partners. And I must say, as someone who worked there for 15 years, it was really important to have those international relationships. So fairly small intelligence apparatus, relatively speaking, for a Western country. But all biases aside, I would say that a very effective intelligence community and one that serves Canadians and Canada very well.
All right. You mentioned about CSE, the Communication Security Establishment of Canada, which is a part of the whole intelligence network. It is also regarded as Canada's most secretive spy agency, if I'm not wrong. It was well pointed about in one of the articles I was reading. So what makes CSE the most secretive agency, considering that it is more technical in nature?
It's a great question, and you certainly are not incorrect. It has traditionally been a very secretive organization. I think the reasons for that stem from any organization that deals in signals intelligence and in cryptography is by definition very, very secretive, because you don't want the people that you're monitoring to realize what your capabilities are. I certainly will say that between the time when I worked at CSE, I joined in 1983, and now, so almost 40 years later, it's a lot less secretive. It's a lot more open. And one of the reasons for that is that CSE has been named by the Canadian government as the government's cyber command. So it is the organization that protects Canadian cyber systems, Canadian computer systems. It has by far the best people in Canada who are experts in this particular field. And so CSC advises private industry as well as government on best practices to take to avoid hacking, to avoid phishing attacks, to avoid infiltration by foreign powers. So yes, a very secretive organization, but one that is slowly coming out of the shadows. It's taken a long time, but they're getting there bit by bit.
So you joined the agency around 1985, in the late 1980s, right? And the world was very different then compared to now. When we look at the emergence of technology and a lot of terrorism has been converted to digital space. How difference when you retired in 2015? How was the difference? What was the difference between there when you joined the before the emergence of internet and a lot of radicalization happening offline to compare to now? What are the major differences?
Wow, what a great question. As I try to remind people, obviously a lot of the people listening will be young students who probably don't remember the Cold War, don't remember the fact that, at a planet level, we were dealing with two very different views of what the world should look like. Of course, the East Bloc and the West Bloc, that defined international relations for the better part of 50 years, from the end of the Second World War until the early 1990s. So it was a different world when I joined in 1983. As I tell people, the summer that I joined, shortly after I joined, there was a Soviet Air Force shot down a Korean airliner over the Kamchatka Peninsula. They claimed it was a U.S. spy plane, and over 200 passengers were killed when a Soviet fighter jet took it out of the sky. And then a month later, this was under Ronald Reagan, as he was president, decided to invade the very small Caribbean island of Grenada, fearing that it was going to be taken over by Cuba, and therefore would introduce Soviet influence into the Western Hemisphere. So a very different world back then. I think the other major difference, getting to the whole terrorism file, is that there was terrorism in the 1980s, but it wasn't the Al-Qaeda type terrorism that we're most, I guess, familiar with these days. Al-Qaeda did exist. It was busy fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s. But in Canada, in particular, we had issues with Sikh extremism. Of course, we had the very infamous Air India attack in 1985, which was the single largest terrorist attack in history prior to 9/11, in which two Canadian Sikh extremists planted bombs on an Air India flight that was bombed out of the sky off the coast of Ireland, killing 329 people. We also had Armenian extremist attacks in Canada. A Turkish diplomat was killed in 1982 by an Armenian extremist, and a security guard was killed in 1985 outside the Turkish embassy. These were Armenian Canadians seeking to punish Turkey for the alleged genocide against Armenians beginning in 1915, so during the First World War. So terrorism was definitely on people's radar in the 1980s. Again, after the wall fell, after the Soviet Union dissolved, we found we had a bit of what we called a peace dividend in the early 1990s. We didn't worry so much about the East Bloc. It had disintegrated, and terrorism was just starting to rise to people's, I think, attention in the 1990s. And of course, as 9/11 occurred, everything changed. We are now 20 years into the so-called war on terrorism, a term that I absolutely detest. Wrote a book calling it For an End to the War on Terrorism, because the term is really not a very good term. So you ask about the whole offline versus online, and it's true that I think with the rise of the internet and the rise of social media, it has changed the nature in which people consume information, in which they share information, and in which they can be influenced by information. We talk a lot about online radicalization, for example. But here's where I want to put a cautionary note in. Based on my experience in security intelligence, yes, online is very important, but offline is equally important. So yes, you can meet people online who can share ideas and inspire you to act, but more often than not, it's the people you know in your actual immediate environment. It's your friends, it's your family, it's the people you go to school with, it's people you go to work with. And so I just caution that we shouldn't say that the only problem to deal with here is the online environment. It is an important environment, and as you're probably aware, I was just reading in The Economist this last week about how Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms are really struggling with trying to take down material that is either hateful or terrorist in nature. And I'm not sure if you use this term in India. It's like playing whack-a-mole. every time you shut down one website, 10 more appear. So it is a huge struggle, I think, for online platforms to do this. But let's not forget that for most people, even, I mean, I live online, you live online, we all live online now. We also live in the offline world. And I think we tend to dismiss the importance of the offline world. As I said, people who decide to carry out attacks, and I think we're going to talk about the Vienna attack in a few minutes. It's turning out really interesting. Some arrests have been made by German officials, Austrian officials, and Swiss officials that they think are people linked to the Vienna attack. In other words, it may not have been just a lone actor, which again just shows once again that it's who you know, whether it's virtually or in real life, that has an impact on your decisions to become radicalized to violence. And I just again, I want to caution that we have to remember and remind ourselves that this is a really, really complicated phenomenon, and we can't reduce it just to, oh, it's all Twitter's fault, or it's all Facebook's fault, or it's all 4chan or 8chan or TikTok or whatever. Most people are complicated people with multiple identities and multiple networks. And if you want to get a handle on this problem, it's really important to be aware of all these different sort of inroads into radicalization and not focus exclusively on the online environment.
So I think since we kind of didn't go through terminology, which I think we should have discussed, and you rightly mentioned, of the way we define terrorism, it varies, and there is not a single, one of the most contested definition we have. We have not come across any definition. The United Nations tries to define it, it couldn't. But still, if you could define what will you consider something which is violent or extreme in nature, and if not the word terrorism, an act of violence, how will you categorize something like that? And a second part is, I'll just add one more thing. So I think there's this thing by David Rappaport, which he categorized 4 waves of terrorism. And the 4th wave is something I think where you started your journey with, is religious extremism. And I think which you specialize in that as well. Yeah. So how do you define something as religious extremism? What considered as something as religious extremism? And why is everyone talking about it so much in these days?
Okay, those are very good questions. And as you noted, last time I counted, there were over 200 definitions of terrorism around the world. So there is absolutely no consensus anywhere. The definition that I rely on as a Canadian, as someone who worked in Canadian intelligence, is what the Canadian Criminal Code says that terrorism is. So very simply, it starts in section 83.01 for those who are interested of the Canadian Criminal Code, and it says that an act of terrorism is an act of serious violence, either planned or executed by somebody who does it for ideological, political, or religious reasons. Now, as you can, I sure appreciate, the word ideology and the word politics and the word religion means different things to different people. Most people, myself included, tend to use the terms violent extremism and terrorism synonymously. That is, they mean the same thing. Others would see them as very different. I tend to just, for reasons of not trying to say terrorism all the time, I use the word violent extremism as well. So it is violent, i.e. you're talking about the killing or maiming of people. And secondly, it is extremist. And what that means is it's not just run-of-the-mill ordinary criminal activity, because you do not want to conflate criminality with terrorism. Terrorism is part of criminality. Criminality is much bigger than terrorism. And I think we get into a lot of problems when we try to say that the two are the same. As a bit of a sidebar, there's a lot of talk here in the West about so-called incels, involuntary celibates, a very small number of which who have carried out attacks and killed people. In fact, 2 in Canada in the past 3 years. And there's a movement to call this terrorism. I have fought back against that because I see it as violent misogyny. I do not see it as terrorism because A, it's not ideology, B, it's not politics, and C, it's not religion. So I know people disagree with me, and this is an ongoing debate, but I certainly understand that people will take the word terrorism and use it to mean what they want it to mean. And we certainly saw in the aftermath of 9/11, a lot of countries that we would consider not to be allies in a Western sense were saying, well, we've been fighting terrorism for decades. Why didn't you notice? And yet we would say you're not fighting terrorism. You're fighting legitimate insurgencies in your countries because you're treating people poorly. So a good example would be the Uyghurs in China, right? There definitely is Uyghur terrorism. There have been Uyghur terrorist attacks in China over the past 6 or 7 years. What China has done is to label all Uyghurs terrorists and all Uyghur activity terrorism. So taking a few examples and extrapolating to an entire population of tens of millions of people, that's not helpful. I don't think we're going to get to a consensus on what terrorism means at any point. It's a very politicized term. And as I said, we're living in a post 9/11 period. It's been almost 20 years now since the attacks in New York and Washington, and that has defined an entire generation. It has changed the dialogue on what terrorism is, what we're going to do about it. I think in many ways, 9/11 is for the generation I'm speaking to what the Kennedy assassination was for my generation in 1963. It defined a whole new, the assassination of a U.S. president changed the dialogue on violence. And 9/11 has changed the dialogue on violence. I'm not going to change that. You're not going to change that. It is what it is. The whole Rappaport issue is a good one. I actually interviewed David Rappaport for a podcast about 6 months ago. I've been following David Rappaport for quite some time. He's an absolutely brilliant man. He's in his 90s, and he's still teaching at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. He's most known for, as you mentioned, his wave theory of terrorism. So without wanting to get into details, there have been 4 major waves of terrorism since the late 19th century. We are living what he calls the 4th wave, the religious wave, which is more or less dated to 1979, which was an incredibly important year because there were 3 major events in that year, all linked to religious extremism. There, of course, was the Iranian Revolution in February, in which the Shah was overthrown and replaced with a Shia theocratic government. We all know that Iran supports terrorist groups across the Middle East. There was, of course, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan on Christmas Day of that year, which led to the creation of Al-Qaeda and sort of the launch of modern Islamist extremism, which had been around for a long time, but it's now in a new phase. An event that doesn't get a lot of notice was the November seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by Saudi Islamist extremists. Everyone forgets about that one. That led to Saudi policy of actually kowtowing and accepting Islamist extremism in their own country. They felt that by giving preachers more power, it would stop terrorism. It was the opposite effect. And that actually launched the Saudi program of sending preachers around the world, intolerant, hateful preachers who espoused a Wahhabist view of Islam. And they spent lots of money. Indonesia is full of Wahhabist preachers. Indonesia never had a problem with Islamist extremism until the Saudi clerics showed up. So this is why this religious wave dates from that year. And of course, it's important to point out that religious extremism is not limited to Islamists. There are Buddhist terrorists, which should be an oxymoron, in Myanmar and in Sri Lanka. And in Thailand, there's a Buddhist monk who advocates the killing of Rohingya Muslims, which is kind of counterintuitive to what Buddhism stands for. Of course, we have Jewish extremists in the West Bank, people who think that the West Bank belongs to the people of Israel and that Palestinians don't belong there. And there have been terrorist attacks carried out by Jewish extremists. Of course, we have links to Christian extremism, especially in the United States with the far right. There are elements of Christian extremism. Sikh extremism hasn't gone away. It is still there. We have Hindu extremism in your country, whereby we have people who are very anti-Muslim and very anti-Christian. You talk about love jihad, which is a ridiculous term, and talk, we have these, what do they call them? These cow vigilantes who are, Hindu extremists who will kill people who consume cows, who consume meat. So I think religious extremism certainly has dominated the discourse over the past 40 years. And when I talked to David Rappaport 6 months ago and I asked him, do you think this wave is ending? He said yes. I disagree with him. I think that the religious wave is an exception. Having said that, though, the first wave of terrorism was the anarchist wave in the 19th century. We still have anarchist terrorism in the year 2020. So the wave theory wasn't meant to say that each terrorism wave has a definitive period of time and then disappears. It doesn't disappear. It may be a little less obvious or a little less representative. But the way that I understand he used the wave theory was to discuss the dominant particularity of terrorism in any given time. So yes, in the 19th century, anarchist terrorism was the dominant form. There are still anarchists today. The dominant form since the late 1970s has been religious extremism. And even if we move on to another stage, and there's a great debate about what the fifth wave will be called, if we have a fifth wave, that does not mean that religious extremism has disappeared. It's not going away anytime soon. And we certainly have seen over the past month in Europe alone, the number of terrorist attacks either carried out or foiled by security intelligence and law enforcement appears to be on the rise. And as I say to my audience, if you want to understand religious terrorism, just follow what's happening in Afghanistan on a daily basis. So the United States has entered into so-called peace talks with the Taliban. The Taliban is a terrorist group and is killing dozens of Afghans on a daily basis. And so, the religious wave, I think, has an awful lot of energy left in it. So it's a great question to ask. And it was a very long answer, and I apologize for that. But this is an extremely complicated issue. And I just wish that people would stop trying to oversimplify what we mean by terrorism and what we mean by violent extremism.
Thank you, sir. That was quite very much defined and very well said on the religious extremism and how ideology, politics, and religion further shape terrorism ahead. So you spoke about Afghanistan and told that we should get daily updates in what happened in Afghanistan. I mean, Ratnadeep and me both are very close observers of neighborhood policies, and I myself have been very active in talking about Afghanistan, having made visits there as well. So I want to talk about joint intelligence cooperation here. You said that Canada has this roots of Khalistani movement, and which has emerged from India, right? So even your defense minister, Shri Harjan Singh, yeah, he was quite. He's not so popular in India because of his Khalistani views.
Yeah.
So how do you think that joint intelligence cooperation with respect to the Khalistani movement should happen between Canada and India?
Wow. What a great question. Yeah, I have.
Also,
Pardon
by
me?
the way, if you know that the Indian, I mean, the media does it all the time. Even the government has blamed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service for not actually pursuing cases and filing missing reports for a lot of, even the Air Flight 182 that you mentioned before. And
Yeah.
a lot of these things that have happened of not actively pursuing the case because a lot of Hawala transaction also happened via this route from Canada for the Khalistani supporters.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not going to apologize for my government because it's not my place, but I have to admit that when I saw that interview with the defense minister, I was actually, the NDP, it's more the head of the NDP, the New Democratic Party, who wouldn't categorically reject Sikh terrorism. I was actually embarrassed because as somebody who worked in security intelligence, when Air India happened, I am actually good friends with an individual who's a lawyer who was 8 years old when his mother was killed on that aircraft. He actually helped to identify his mother's body. The fact that we're not categorically denouncing any form of terrorism, to me, is unacceptable. You may have seen that even my prime minister did not initially condemn the beheading of the teacher in France last week. He has since sort of backpedaled and tried to undo what he did last week. That to me is unacceptable. To me, any form of terrorism must be denounced. I don't care what type of it is, whether it's Islamist extremism or the far right or Hindu terrorism or Sikh terrorism, what it is. Terrorism is terrorism is terrorism. Even if we can't agree on a definition, we know what terrorism is. And I think that it is incumbent on all of us to not just denounce it, but to work together to prevent it. From my perspective, and you have to understand that, obviously I no longer work in the Canadian intelligence community. I've been retired for the past 5.5 years. But from my perspective, when you work in security intelligence, you do everything in your power to collect information, to process it, to corroborate it, to see if it's true, because, guess what? People lie. We certainly saw that with the American decision to go into Iraq 2003. That was based on faulty intelligence, incorrect intelligence. We do what we can. And then the way that CSIS works in Canada is CSIS is authorized to advise the government of Canada. So we say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's what we think it means. The government is not obligated to take the information that's provided to it. It's part of all other types of considerations. And as you can imagine, any government has any number of people trying to influence it, trying to get it to adopt certain policies, to construct its internal and foreign relations. So even intelligence in the world, you may find that there are other considerations that are being considered more seriously or more importantly by the government of the day. I would like to think that intelligence is an important part of that puzzle. Obviously, I'm very biased, having spent more than 3 decades in that particular field. But I also recognize that when you're running a country, there are lots of things sort of on your plate simultaneously, and there are lots of things that enter into decision making. So I'm not saying this to excuse what my government is saying. I would say that they should denounce categorically any form of terrorism. But I certainly understand that they will do what they are doing, or any government will, based on what it thinks is the right policy to go forward. Governing a country is complicated. There are a lot of moving parts, as I said. Intelligence is just one of those parts. It's an important part, but it's not the only one. I'm not sure if that's a satisfactory answer to your question, but to me, as I said, we do have an obligation to investigate terrorism, irrespective of what that form of terrorism takes. The challenge is becoming terrorist movements and different terrorist ideologies are multiplying. So to give you a very, I guess, concrete example, when I worked for the security service, most of our resources on counterterrorism were devoted to Islamist extremism. Why? Because that was the greatest threat. We foiled several plots here in Canada in the 2000s and the 2010s. We've had 5 or 6 successful attacks in Canada since 2014. 2 people have died in terrorist attacks in Canada since that time. We did not have a very robust far-right terrorism investigative effort when I worked there. Now, I left in 2015. My understanding is that has changed, is that because we are concerned about far-right extremism in Canada. The problem then becomes you've only got finite resources, and you have to devote the finite resources to infinite threats. So if you take resources away from Islamist extremism to look at the far right, what happens if Islamist extremism rises again or gets more difficult? What about Sikh extremism? What about far left extremism? What about anarchist extremism? And this is the challenge when you work in this field, is that you never have enough resources to devote to all the threats that are out there. You take your direction in part from the government, and you take your direction from what you're seeing developing on the ground. So you're able to act independently in the allocation of resources. You also have to listen to what the government lists as its priorities. All that to say, it's a very complicated environment right now. And I've been saying for years, getting back to the Sikh question, Sikh terrorism has not gone away. And there's good evidence that there are still Sikh extremists here in Canada who are advocating for violence to be used to create the independent Khalistan. What we're doing about it, I don't know. As I said, I'm a couple years out. But to me, I don't think it would be a priority for us for the simple reason that there are other higher priorities. In a perfect world, you would have enough resources to look at all the priorities. Alas, gentlemen, this is not a perfect world. And I don't think the resources, especially you have to take into account now during COVID, all of our governments are struggling just to keep the lights on because of the amount of money that's being spent in wage subsidies and trying to keep the country working. Governments are entering into trillions of dollars of debt. And for any security intelligence agency to say, hi, we need more money, isn't going to happen right now. It's as simple as that. There are other priorities going on. So it's a really great question, and it's a hard one to answer because I think that life is complicated and governing a country is complicated, and there are always competing demands for resources. So when you're on the cabinet table and you have your public safety minister saying we need more money, well, so does the health ministry saying the same thing, and so is the environment ministry saying the same thing. And so is the defense minister saying the same thing. So these are very, very drawn out, complicated conversations that take place to demand money and resources. I wish I could give you a better answer to that question. I think it's an important one, but I think that's the reality we're facing now at the end of 2020.
So I think that actually answers a lot of the part that we have mentioned. And of course, as you mentioned that you served there in the agency and you could answer to the best of your capacity to the limited information that you can give it to us. So thank you so much for answering that. Now, now something let me come to which you have written a lot, and I thought this is something which I should also address a little bit initially. Then, as we go on, we'll have more questions on this. On the issue of foreign fighters, now as an intelligence point of view, I see there are like threefold challenges when you have to deal with foreign fighters phenomenon. One of the first one is of making a accurate risk analysis and assessment of people who are returning.
Mm-hmm.
The second one I feel is how challenge is how revolves on the question how will you follow up with persons who are returning,
Mm-hmm.
and what are the legal options available, and what are the risk associated with the different tools they have carried. Did they have any combat training or anything
Mm-hmm.
while they were in the particular country? Uh, how do you go with this risk assessment, and how do you identify those returnees who could have been under the combat training? As we have seen a lot of these people, in fact, for the Vienna shooting as well. Uh, these are foreign fighters, right? How do you do a risk assessment for this, and how important it is? Because during the time when you actually retired was a time when it was at the peak.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with it in the agency?
Right. Okay. This is the book everyone should read, Western Foreign Fighters, that I wrote in 2015. It's a great question, and I think that many governments are struggling with what to do with this. So let's set the scene here. We know that somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people went to join Islamic State and other terrorist groups in Iraq and Syria beginning in 2013, 2014. 30 to 40,000 people. My country estimates that upwards of 200 people have left to join terrorist groups. Now, that number does not limit to Islamic State. It includes Al Qaeda. It includes Al Shabaab. We had a huge issue with Somali Canadians joining Al Shabaab in the 2000s and other terrorist groups around the world. The government has stated publicly that they think that about 60 of those 200 are dead, 60 are still active, and 60 have already returned home, which is an interesting question. The big debate now in Canada is, should we in fact bring back those who have been captured and are now sitting in either prisons or in refugee camps in Iraq and Syria? I have been quite categorical in my statements since then, and my answer is no, we should not repatriate these people for the simple reason that their crimes were committed in other countries, and those countries have a right to bring those people to trial for the offenses that were committed on their soil. Who am I as a Canadian to demand that Iraq or Syria or Somalia or Algeria or whatever does not have a sovereign right to arrest and try someone for crimes committed on their territory? I mean, let me give you an analogy here. What if a Canadian was caught dealing in child pornography in Thailand, or a Canadian was caught selling drugs in Pakistan? Does Pakistan not have a right to try that person for selling drugs in Pakistan? Absolutely. Does Thailand not have a right to charge the person with dealing in child pornography? Absolutely. And yet I don't hear a great lobby group here in Canada trying to get child pornographers and drug dealers back to our country. So it's a bit of an inconsistency on that part. The way that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms reads in Canada is that a Canadian has a right to return. A Canadian has a right to leave and a right to return. Now, they don't have a right to leave to join a terrorist group. That's an offense under the criminal code. So we should have arrested them in the first place. Had we known they were going to join ISIS or Al Shabaab, we should have arrested them and charged them. We didn't, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. Despite the fact they have a right to return, there is no obligation to actually facilitate that return. We don't have to send the Army or the Air Force or whomever to go and rescue you from Iraq or Syria or Somalia. If you make it home, we have to let you in. I do not believe in citizenship revocation. I do not believe in canceling citizenship like some countries like the UK have. That to me is a very bad policy. The reasons why I am against repatriation, the first reason is that other countries have a right to try you because of the offenses committed in their territory. Secondly, you talked about risk assessment, and that's a really difficult issue because in order to do risk assessment, you have to investigate these people upon their return. One of the problems, and people say, well, just bring them back and charge them. Charge them with what? Based on what? Do we have evidence that will stand the test of a Canadian court? Because if it's intelligence and not evidence, that's a very different thing in Canada. Intelligence in my country is not collected to what we call an evidentiary standard, which means it cannot be used in court. It's not evidence. So that's the problem number one. Secondly, while these people are sitting in camps or prisons in Iraq or Syria or Somalia, they're not investigative priorities for the security intelligence community. If we repatriate them, we have to put resources on them, surveillance resources, going to court to get warrants to intercept their communications, recruiting human sources against them. And that takes resources and money. And as I just said, we already have too few resources. Why would a country create problems for itself that it doesn't have to by bringing back people which require those types of resources? I don't think the security intelligence and law enforcement agencies have the manpower to do this. They're already acting at full capacity. So in other words, while they're there, you don't have to worry about them. Now, in terms of the risk assessment, the data that I've seen, and there's a literature out there on returning so-called foreign fighters. And the percentage of people who actually return to their countries and plan an act of terrorism is somewhere between 1 and 10%. Okay, so it's not 95%, it's not even 50%, it's between 1 and 10%, which is very low. So that's a good thing. The problem, as we saw in Vienna and as we saw in Paris recently, the problem is from the public's perspective. They don't care that the percentage is only 1% or 2%. They want it to be zero. So if you bring somebody home and you monitor them and you decide they don't pose a threat, so you apply your risk assessment model and you conclude they don't pose a threat, and you let them go and you stop investigating them, and 6 months later, they carry out an attack in which 5 people are dead, or 20 or 25 or 100, what does the public say to you? Why did you fail? Why did you not prevent this attack from happening? There's one thing that when you work in security intelligence or law enforcement that you know from day one. You are only as good as your last failure. Nobody cares when you get it right. They expect you to get it right. They only care when you get it wrong. And so governments are reluctant to bring these people back for fear that 1 or 2 or 10 will carry out an act of terrorism on Canadian soil, which will look bad on the government. It'll look bad on the Security Intelligence Agency. It'll look bad on the RCMP, the Federal Law Enforcement Agency, and all the other government departments, Canada Border Services, whatever, who didn't do enough to prevent this attack from happening. That's the calculus that governments are making right now. They're saying to themselves, if we don't have to expend money and resources to repatriate these people, we won't. If they make their way back, we cannot prevent their entry under the Constitution, but we will not go out of our way to try to get them back. That's been Canada's policy so far. It appears to have been the policy of most Western governments as well. There are some exceptions. The United States is one of them. But then again, the United States, nobody has been cleared of terrorism since 9/11. Every single trial results in a guilty verdict. That's the atmosphere in the United States over the past 20 years. The attacks in Vienna and the attacks in Paris, as you're probably seeing, are leading to a new dialogue. President Macron in France is calling for a review of the Schengen system, which is the freedom of movement within the European Union. There's talk about doing a lot more security in Europe to prevent more attacks from happening. And yet there are still tens of thousands of fighters and their families who are sitting in camps. I have advocated bringing the children home because the children are not terrorists. But I've also advocated that those children should be removed from their parents because the parents are not fit to raise them. No parent who brings their child to enter ISIS qualifies, in my books, as a good parent. You know, the state has the authority to remove children from their parents under the most severe circumstances: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional or mental abuse. This, to me, is a combination of mental and emotional abuse. If a mother and a father brought their child to live in the caliphate, I see those people as not worthy of having those children. I've been criticized for that. I've been criticized for advocating that. To me, the children should be rescued, and they're rescued. We've brought one back so far. She was an orphan. Her parents had been killed. Bring all the children back. Let those who join Islamic State or Hayat Tahrir Shams or whatever the groups are in Iraq and Syria, or Al-Shabaab in Somalia, let them stand trial where their crimes were committed. That's my position, and I've been quite consistent in that over the past couple of years.
Thank you for putting that out as well. I think that's that. I think people who are watching this, especially policymakers, will take a note of that, because it's a very important point you made. Because I was seeing, I think, a video in the Idlib camp in Syria, and I saw how many children were being stuck there, especially without any education as well, access to education or proper healthcare.
Exactly.
So one of the other things that you mentioned while you mentioning the other points is how it becomes very difficult to understand, even if you try to this foreign fighters actually return. There is no conclusive evidence of their actual presence in Syria, because a lot of these people slip from the Turkey border, and the reasons for actually going there, or what were who were they with, even if they were in Syria, and what are the things, or what are the felony they have committed there. In this respect, either until unless, especially with the Canadian law, until unless you get conclusive evidence or video footages of any action or crimes they've committed, how difficult it has become to prosecute anyone, even if you know for a fact, or he has actually admitted that he has committed crimes, any sort of crime.
This is proving to be a real difficult thing for Canadian courts. I think we've had one conviction so far of a man who went to join Islamic State and came back. So we were able to prove it in one case, but these trials are very, very difficult for the reasons we've already talked about. It's how do you gather evidence? Do we trust the information that maybe Turkey or Iraq or Syria has given us? You know, with specific reference to Syria, a couple of years ago, we had a very famous case where there were 3 individuals, Canadians, who were Syrian, who traveled to Syria to see family, were taken by Syrian authorities, and alleged they were tortured because they had links to terrorist groups. And Canada shared some information with the Syrian government, what we knew about these individuals. These individuals sued the Canadian government for having shared the information, and the government awarded them $10 million each for having been tortured by Syria, saying that Canada was complicit in sharing intelligence with Syria. Canada should have known that Syria was going to torture these individuals. So you can imagine what kind of impact that's had on any government's decision to use information from Syria. We're not going to touch Syria with a 10-foot pole, because we just paid out $30 million to 3 Canadians who were alleged to have been tortured by the Syrian government. This is the problem. So we talked about intelligence sharing before, and the fact that CSIS has the authority under its legislation to enter into an intelligence sharing agreement. Well, I would say there's 2 types of sharing agreements. There's sharing agreements with countries that are very like you. So in the case of Canada, that would be, you know, the United States, United Kingdom, most of Western Europe, you know, countries that have similar systems to us. And then there are countries that have systems that are very, very different than what we have here in Canada. And I think it's always a judgment call as to how to use intelligence that you gain from allies. Setting aside the intelligence versus evidence issue, how reliable is the information that you're being sent? So we would say, for example, that if we received intelligence from France, that's probably more reliable than information we receive from, I don't know, Tajikistan or China or Sri Lanka, for example. Not to say that those intelligence agencies aren't competent, but there are other things going on in those countries which might affect the nature of the intelligence that's being shared. All that to say that the prosecution of returning terrorist foreign fighters is very, very complicated. As I said, I can think of only one conviction we've had so far. We did have an attack 3 years ago by a young lady who got as far as Turkey, wanted to join ISIS. She was turned back by Turkish authorities. She came back to Canada. She was investigated a little bit. She was let go. And then she walked into a hardware store and she tried to attack employees with a bow and arrow. She didn't kill anybody, and she was found guilty of terrorism. She was not found guilty of leaving the country to join ISIS. We have yet to, I think, with one exception, had any success in prosecuting people successfully for wanting to leave the country to join a terrorist group. And we've had equally little success in prosecuting those who've come back to Canada. As I said, the Canadian government recognizes that 60 people have come back from fighting with terrorist groups. To the best of my knowledge, not one single person has been successfully prosecuted for having returned to Canada because of all the difficulties in gathering and assessing evidence. So this problem is not going to be resolved anytime soon. It seems to be one that is intractable in some ways. I think we can learn from what other countries are doing. One thing I want to point out is interesting that people said, well, we have to bring them back because they're sitting in refugee camps in Kurdistan or whatever. The Kurds have recently been receiving assistance from the Swedes in setting up their own judicial system, in setting up a court system where they can actually try these people in Kurdish territory. Now, we recognize Kurdish territory is a bit controversial. The Turks don't want it, the Syrians don't want it, the Iraqis don't want it. But the Kurds seem to be a competent government to some extent, and they're now receiving assistance from the Western world in trying to establish a court system in which they can use fair methods to try these people under international law for having committed acts of terrorism. So this notion that Kurdistan can't do it seems to be changing. And again, that is the best scenario. You want to try people not only because the acts were committed on their territory, but the victims are from their territory. And the victims have a right to see the people who killed their family to be tried in the country where they live. That to me is the underlying principle behind all of this. Those who are victims of crime have a right to see just punishment for the people that did what they did to them and their families.
Okay, all right. So I'll go for the next one.
Mm.
Yeah. So you discussed about foreign fighters and how the kind of prosecution can be done and multiple things related to that. Let's come to homegrown terrorists who operate from a different shield, pledging alliance on a personal level and wannabe ISIS terrorists. These elements in Western countries and especially Canada, in Europe, in Argentina, in Sweden, in Stockholm, in France, these elements have gained a tremendous amount of attention with their activities and with their conducts all around. So what one can calculate is that ISIS is not just an ideology, is not just a terror outfit. It's an ideological movement which is spreading and gaining roots all across the region. So what is the correct counter narrative to this ever expanding ideological movement? Because even though people say that ISIS has been completely destroyed and completely vanished from the geographical relevance, but still it somehow finds a very sizable amount of space in people's hearts and minds.
Yeah.
So how do we come to counter that narrative?
How much time do we have? Can I spend the next 3 weeks talking about this? No,
I wish.
It's a fantastic question, Siddhant. It really, really is. So the way that I've always described Islamist terrorism and the groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda is there's three different levels. There's what we call the Al Qaeda or ISIS core. These are the people that actually belong to the group. So with Al Qaeda, it was in Afghanistan in the 1980s and 90s, 2000s. ISIS was in Iraq in the 2010s. So they had an actual place. So Al Qaeda was in Afghanistan, ISIS was in Iraq and Syria. Then their second level is what we call the affiliates. These are groups that take inspiration from the groups, and they actually call themselves. So we had, for example, we still have Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Akim, very active in Algeria and in Libya and sometimes in Morocco. We have Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, very active in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. We have Al Qaeda in India.
In Indian subcontinent.
Yeah. Exactly. same with ISIS. There's upwards of 20 ISIS affiliates in the world. There's Islamic State West Africa, Islamic State in the Greater Sahel, Islamic State Central African Province, Islamic State in Afghanistan, Khorasan Province, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the second level. The third level are what I call the independents, those who are inspired by Islamic State and or Al-Qaeda. And when I worked in security intelligence, the investigations we were doing were mostly that third category, as you said, the so-called homegrown. These are people who do not belong to the core group. They do not belong to an affiliate, but they see themselves as part of the greater movement. They take inspiration from it, and they want to act in its name. So they'll often do things saying, I did this for ISIS. There was an attack 2 years ago against a police officer in Western Canada by a man who hit him with a car and then tried to. Luckily, the police officer was wearing protective armor and didn't get killed. He had an ISIS flag in his car. He probably couldn't spell ISIS, but he saw himself as part of ISIS. So he's part of that third category. What you're seeing happen now as well is that groups like ISIS are encouraging that third category in their propaganda. They're telling people, you don't have to come here anymore. The caliphate has been temporarily dissolved. We're coming back, by the way, one day, but for now, don't get on a plane to come here because we don't have the space for you. What we want you to do is stay in your home countries and do it where you are. Do it in our name. And they say it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to fly planes into buildings. All you have to do is get into a run someone over, like we saw in Barcelona, like we saw in Nice a couple of years ago, or in Stockholm, or pick up a knife, or a machete, or a gun, or a bow and arrow. You know, the analogy I've been using, this strategy by Islamic State and to an equal extent by Al-Qaeda, it's what I call the Nike brand of terrorism. Just do it. Do what you can with what you can. And they've been remarkably successful at this. So if you look at the attacks that have taken place, they're often by people who want to be part of the group, couldn't travel for all kinds of reasons. Either they were stopped or they didn't have enough money or they didn't have logistics. And what you also see, interestingly, is in the aftermath of an attack, within 1 or 2 days, what happens? ISIS puts out a statement saying one of our soldiers, one of our warriors in Austria or Sweden or Canada or wherever was, a hero of Islam. He was a lion of Islam and he carried out an attack killing the infidels. So even if the person did not do it for ISIS, ISIS claims it, because it keeps ISIS at the front of the agenda. And what ISIS wants to do is say, you know what? We don't have the caliphate anymore. Again, temporarily, we're going to recreate it, but we're still in your backyards. And we're still capable of carrying out attacks in your country. So you may have thought you defeated us. Well, guess what? You didn't. We're still active. We can still harm you anywhere in the world. We can reach out. We'll find you wherever you are, and we'll carry out attacks. That, to me, really describes the so-called homegrown terrorist phenomenon, is that these are individuals who they've radicalized the violence, partly online, partly offline. They see themselves as part of a greater movement. We had a famous plot back in the mid-2000s by a group that's called the Toronto 18. It was our largest terrorist cell we've ever had. And one of their plans was, they called themselves Al-Qaeda in Canada, which was complete garbage. They weren't Al-Qaeda in Canada, but they saw themselves inspired by Al-Qaeda. They were a completely homegrown cell. The ideology and the recommendations of Al-Qaeda core to try to carry out an attack in Canada. And thankfully, because they were infiltrated with human sources and surveillance and warrants, we knew everything they were doing and we arrested them before they could carry out their attack. But I think you're seeing this happen a lot. And if I could just make one small point as well, I don't think this is happening as much in your country, but in my country, there's an awful lot of talk about, it's all about the far right. The far right is by far the greatest terrorist threat to Canada. And that is also garbage. The Islamist extremists never went away. And my fear is that we've either grown tired of talking about Islamist extremism, or we want to move on for politically correct reasons. What's happened in France and Austria over the last couple of days, the Belgians just by the way, arrested 2 minors who had pledged allegiance to ISIS. They want to carry an attack against a police station. The Americans just arrested somebody who wanted to killed police in Oregon. He was an ISIS wannabe. So again, to underscore my earlier point, it's all of the above simultaneously. And we seem to have forgotten this notion that Islamist extremism is still a major threat. Again, if you do the numbers around the world, you look at terrorist attacks around the world globally, 99% of terrorist attacks are carried out by Islamist extremists. If you throw in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Somalia and Nigeria and Yemen and Iraq and Syria and most of the West, most of the attacks are by Islamist extremists in 2020. So let's not forget about these guys. Yes, we have to deal with the far right, absolutely, but not to the detriment of worrying about Islamist extremism. So this homegrown phenomenon is not going away either. I think we're going to see more and more people who want to be part of greater movements, who are inspired by these movements, will be planning more terrorist attacks around the world.